I was scared mine would be a stupid question, but are we somewhere near the end of the curve? A new curve is seemingly in the horizon. And do we really have the resources to walk to the horizon and to say bye to it?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is we are not saying bye. That is not happening. And there are reasons why it isn't happening. The first thing is anytime you have a virus that can spread without symptoms in people, it becomes harder to get rid of. So, an example of that is, for example, you know what we did with polio? Polio was much harder to get rid of in India. It's still in Pakistan, still in Afghanistan. But with a lot of effort, we got to the point of saying no polio in our country. Why was it possible with polio and is not possible with SARS CoV 2? Because polio only infects humans. SARS CoV 2, sorry, SARS CoV 2 infects humans and animals, and it can go from humans to animals and back again. So, when you have a virus that one is asymptomatic, spreading among people without any symptoms at all, and two, you have a virus that can cross a species barrier, that pretty much makes it impossible to get rid of. Now, this is also an RNA virus. RNA viruses have this characteristic of whenever they copy themselves, they make mistakes. And the mistakes are mutations, right? And some of those mutations kill the virus. It doesn't replicate anymore. Some of those mutations don't matter at all. Nothing changes about the virus. And then there are some mutations that matter, that give the virus abilities that it didn't have before. So when we start to think about all the variants that are being described, these are viruses that have acquired new characteristics. And that's why we need to understand them better, think about what it is that we can do, whether vaccines, drugs, etc. are going to work, whether they spread better or not. When you have an RNA virus, this kind of evolution will continue to happen. And in fact, for SARS CoV 2, the evolution is actually very slow. I know it doesn't sound like it, but it's actually one of the slowest viruses that we have in terms of evolution. It's got a very big genome and it can correct the errors that it makes. But the reason that we are seeing all of these so quickly is because it's multiplying so much. Every time it multiplies, every time it replicates, there's a chance for it to mutate. And when you have millions and billions of replication cycles, then the mutations add up. So that's what we are seeing. It's actually not evolving quicker than other RNA viruses. It's evolving at a relatively slow pace, but because there are so many replication cycles happening, we are seeing these mutations. Now, what does the future hold? Will there be more mutations? Absolutely. And they'll all go through the same thing of some matter, some don't matter, some are deleterious to the virus itself. Now, when we think about the ones that matter for public health, what will happen is all of us will have encounters with this virus. We'll have it in the form of vaccines, we'll have it in the form of infections, and we'll keep seeing this virus. And we do this with common cold viruses, we do this with diarrhea, with respiratory viruses. We are doing these encounters all the time. The difference here is usually you see these respiratory diarrhea viruses, etc., in children. That's why when you send kids to school, they start coming home sick. Essentially, we are all going to school in the last 2 years. We are encountering a virus that we haven't seen before. So we have to build up our experience with the virus with time. It's nothing to be scared of. It's a natural process that happens. And if we are protected from the severe end of the spectrum, then in general, this is a virus that we will learn to handle. In fact, if you look even among the coronaviruses that we've had in the last 20 years, this one is the weakest virus. I know it sounds incredible, but we've had 3 coronaviruses. The SARS coronavirus, the original one, infected 8,000 people, and it killed 1 in 10 of the people that it infected. The MERS coronavirus, which we still have circulating, mostly in the Middle East, kills 1 out of 3 people it infects. This one is nothing in comparison. It's just that the numbers are so huge that that tiny proportion becomes a big number. And that again is the worry that we have currently with Omicron, that the numbers will get so big that even if everything is milder, there will be people who will get really sick with it. So, quite frankly, this is something that you cannot think there is an end to. What we have to think about is what's the path forward.
Hello, doctor. My name's Deepak, and before my question, right, I would like to thank you and as with other health workers, right, for your service in this crisis. Second point I would say is my parents are a big fan of your words on the various TV news channels, right? So it's treated as gospel in my household. So, so I have a two-part question, doctor. First thing is, how careful should we with the new Omicron variant? Because I somehow seeing what's happening, especially in UK, Denmark, and other countries, it feels like a premonition that there is a wave. They get hit with a wave. When that wanes, right, then it somehow picks up in India. So is it going to be something similar in the coming months? So, was this a good idea to have this event in person rather than virtual? So that's my first question, doctor.
So, one is, how do we want to live life, right? At what stage does it become okay for us to be out and about, even with a certain level of precaution? And the way I think about it is to think about what's happening around the country. What are the signals that we are seeing? It's a bit like, I use the analogy of dressing for the weather, right? When it's raining, carry an umbrella. When it's cold, wear a sweater. When there are lots of cases outside, cut down your activities. When there are very few cases outside, then expand your activities. So that's how I think we should think about the risks that we are taking. Can we bring risk down to zero? Yes. By never talking to any other person or animal or no interactions whatsoever, your risk will be pretty much zero, because you'll be living with your own microorganisms and not acquiring any new ones. But we can't live like that. So we have to learn what are risk tolerances. Do you want to be without a mask? With whom? And in what kinds of situations, right? We have a great understanding now of the things that work. Masks work, ventilation works, limiting the number of unknown people works. So these are things we can control. And if you calibrate your own risk as well as the risk for your parents, which will be a different order of risk, then you can decide what kinds of activities are acceptable for you, what kinds of activities are acceptable for them, and work with that. Okay? So it's not impossible to do. I think we have to stop making this the center of our existence. We have lives to live. We have to get evolve a way of working with this and move on. Omicron, okay, I'm carrying on for a little longer, coming back to your first question, which was Omicron. Now, when the Alpha variant really took off in the UK, remember what happened this time last year? We shut down flights from the UK. Did we stop Alpha? We didn't. It's just that in India, Alpha started to take off in places like Punjab and Delhi, and then Delta came in and took it over. So we were actually pioneers for Delta, and Beta never really came here and established itself. In fact, it went to very few places in the world. So when you're at the start of something, it's very difficult to see what the way ahead is going to be. And right now, it's even more difficult because last year we didn't have vaccination. We didn't have the kind of infection history that our population now has. So that made it very challenging to figure out what the future held. Now, at least now we have a better chance of scenarios. What are we seeing with Omicron? Very, very, very transmissible. Which means when we think about masks, as soon as Omicron is heading towards establishing itself, improve the quality of your mask, think about double masking, think about limiting crowds, increasing ventilation. Make sure that everybody you know and are interacting with are people that are vaccinated. And we also need to have the policy decisions on boosters and everything else. What should we be scared of this? Well, that depends on how severe the disease gets and how much reinfection this virus can cause. It already looks like it causes reinfections in people who are vaccinated. And the reinfection only matters because it allows for the virus to spread further. We don't know yet whether reinfections in vaccinated people are going to result in severe disease. So far, there is no signal that is telling us that it's completely breaking through vaccination-induced immunity or infection-induced immunity. We know it's less, but it doesn't seem to be causing severe disease like it was last year. So we are very differently placed today than we were last year. Should we be completely casual about this? No, because a small percentage of a very big number is actually pretty big numbers. So we should worry, and particularly if you have people who are older or vulnerable for other reasons, make sure that you have plans for them. One of the things that I find is really helpful is scenario planning. What happens if someone gets sick? Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? What do I need to know? Who do I need to talk to? What should I be checking up on? So if you think about what your absolute worst case scenario might be and plan for it, you're better equipped to be able to handle it. Most likely it won't happen, but at least you've thought through the process and you won't panic when it does happen.
The two articles that you published recently on two very different subjects. The first obvious one is with several hundred scientists like you asking the government for data on which you can do it. And the question I'm asking is, why isn't the government responding to that kind of thing? Why are they trying to hold it back? And if I may finish the second one, with respect to the vaccination of children, maybe she's going to ask the same question. A few weeks ago in Bangalore, central Bangalore, one of the schools suddenly got all the people who were in the 5th standard to be vaccinated. Forget about consent, leave alone informed consent. They just turned up one day, all the boys, I'm saying too much, were just given the jabs with Covaxin.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't matter whether Covaxin or Covishield or something else, but it was done. And it is one of the prominent schools in Bangalore. I'm relating that to the article that you wrote earlier and the fact that, I think it was yesterday, Pfizer has said that the vaccine doesn't seem to work with very young children.
Yeah.
If you could like to respond to those two in an open manner.
Sure. The first thing is about data and why the government doesn't share data. Well, there are data that are available at state level that are sometimes better than what is available at the national level. But what I'm seeing is that the data is actually in three broad buckets, at least in terms of the public health data that we have. One is the Indian Council for Medical Research, where all the testing data goes. You have this 3-page form that has to be filled up every time you get a test. They don't think about the burden that it places on people that need to get the test done. And what really happens is that the data that goes into those forms tends to be quite poor quality. Whenever you are asked to do something repetitively, and nobody checks to see the quality of the data that is going in, the information that is collected through this humongous exercise can be something that has very limited utility. Similarly, NCDC collects data from the states on all the hospitalizations and the deaths and everything else, the outcomes of people who tested positive. And the third is CoWIN and the vaccination. Now, CoWIN is an electronic platform, and every minute, there are updates on how many people are getting vaccinated, with which vaccine, etc. These three databases are not linked together. And one of the things that we've been asking for is, if we need to understand who tested positive and what their vaccination history was, or who tested positive and wound up in a hospital, how do we get that information? Because all of these data are in silos and there is no single identifier across all of the databases, we cannot necessarily access this in the comprehensive manner that we want. Now, we've tried. We've made an appeal to the government. We've made suggestions to the government about this is the minimum data set that we would like to see by age, by vaccination status, by location, by type of vaccine. What it has resulted in is one thing, which is, if you go to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, they have something called the COVID-19 vaccine tracker. And that has deaths in unvaccinated individuals, deaths in vaccinated with 1 dose, and deaths in vaccinated by 2 doses. It also has it by age, but it doesn't tell you which vaccine. It doesn't tell you where these deaths are occurring. It doesn't tell you anything about individuals or comorbidities or even numbers, because all information is presented as a percentage. So if you want to sit there and calculate in this age group, this is the proportion of the Indian population, therefore there were so many deaths in this week, that's the only way you can get at the original data behind the graphs that are displayed on the website. I think even the reason we wrote the letter, the reason Gautam and I keep banging on about these things is because even if we change today, this will have value going forward. We discussed, we're going to be living with this virus. The vaccines that are available to us are going to change. We need to monitor their performance. We've never been in a situation before where we've had the opportunity or potential opportunity to use so many different vaccines. Wouldn't you want to know which vaccine is best? Which is best in terms of safety, which is best in terms of duration of protection, which is best in terms of protecting people with comorbidities? We want to know all this. And the only way you can get this information is by doing real world vaccine effectiveness studies. These are not complicated studies to do. This information is ostensibly being collected. And if we had access to it, we could do the comparisons and we could make decisions based on actual data. Remember when we do phase 3 efficacy trials, the biggest trial, Zydus Cadilla's trial, 28,500 individuals, half of whom got vaccine. How many doses of vaccine have been given in the country? 1.3 billion. How many people do we have vaccine effectiveness data from? Well, we had the Tamil Nadu police contributing data on 1 lakh vaccinated people. Punjab government doing about 90,000 people. One report from the army. And the rest are all effectiveness studies that are coming from hospitals looking at their own population of healthcare workers, which varies from 5,000 to 10,000 to 12,000. So 1.3 billion doses of vaccine given, which presumably is at least 600 million people vaccinated. And the data that we have on vaccine effectiveness 11 months after the program started is less than 500,000 people. It's such a waste. And India is a country that has the ability. We do this for the world. Bangalore does this, right? Handle data.
Yes, my name is Dia, and I have 2 questions. First one is, how many diseases are there in the world?
Unnumbered. There are lots. So when we start to study disease, right, there are common diseases and there are uncommon diseases. And we have not described every bacteria, every virus, every parasite that causes infections in humans. We've even, in the last 30 or 40 years, we've realized that there are infectious diseases that are just proteins that have the ability to spread from person to person. So the more we study, the more diseases we find. But what makes diseases matter are 2 things. One is, how many people get that disease, right? And when do they get it? So if you look at something that infects half the world's population, that's something for us to worry about. The second thing we worry about are killer diseases, where your chances of dying if you get that disease are very, very high. So Ebola is an example of that, where you have a very high fatality rate for Ebola. But we have a vaccine for that now.
And which is the most dangerous disease in the world?
So, all diseases have the potential to kill people. Okay, if you don't pay attention to a disease, it can kill people. But if you take a disease that has a very high case fatality rate, among the highest are what are called viral hemorrhagic fevers. Ebola is certainly one of them, but we have one in India too, which is the Nipah virus. And Nipah, there were 16 people who had Nipah virus in 2018, 2 people lived.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Yeah, it's nice that we are getting a chance to interact with you physically when we have always been following your news and talk. Basically, my question is, I just want to know what is your take on regarding taking the vaccine booster now, especially when we have Omicron with mutation reporting in the spike. Yeah, research are still going on. I mean, we are in the process of making new vaccines which should work for it. But with the current that we have, is it advisable to take it, and in how many months should we get it?
So there are lots of things to think about when we think about boosters. I know high-income countries are giving boosters to their entire adult population, but it's not clear yet that we really need boosters for everybody. It's clear that if you are older, if you have comorbidities, there will be an incremental benefit across everybody. there will be some benefit in taking a booster. Is that 1% or 20%? That's the question. Are you willing to take a booster now if it gives you only 1% improvement? Remember that young and healthy people infected with any variant are going to have asymptomatic or mild disease for the most part. 95% of cases in young healthy people are going to be asymptomatic or mild, right? Who do we need to worry about? Who do we need to protect with boosters, and where should we be generous with boosters? It's really in people who are vulnerable, and the biggest vulnerability is age. And then that is followed by people with comorbidities. So if we said, as an insurance policy, we have plenty of doses available in the country now, we are not using this dose as a booster by taking it away from someone else, then at the individual level, there's definite benefit in taking boosters, and at the population level, protecting your most vulnerable has advantages with boosters. What are you doing? You're giving yourself an insurance policy at a time when things are very uncertain. It may turn out that boosters were not required at all.
Hi, Doctor. My question is, we live in the age of the internet, but we also live in the age of misinformation and fake news. So how hard do you think your job has been in this time?
Everything from countering rumors on fertility to, it's been hard. And I think people, especially scientists, and I think scientists do a better job than governments do, but transparency about what you know and what you don't know is critical. And we haven't really seen that. You cannot be, I have perfect knowledge today in an evolving situation. And yet that is the way that it is frequently presented by policymakers. And even where scientists and doctors are concerned, I'm really worried about the fact that so many doctors are so confident about everything that they say. When, I was a little nervous when I got into this right at the beginning, because I thought, yes, I study infectious diseases, I study viruses, I study mucosal infectious diseases, but I specifically don't study respiratory viruses and coronaviruses, so I can't call myself an expert. Then I discovered that, you have cardiologists and cardiothoracic surgeons and transplant surgeons, and maybe it's something to do with surgery, but they are supremely confident about everything. But I know I'm not. And what I try to do is, when I speak, I talk about the limits of what I know, the things that are uncertain or evolving, or what potential the future could hold. So, yeah, it's been really challenging dealing with sort of misinformation, as well as dealing with what you can call half-baked information.
Good afternoon, ma'am. So my family got infected with corona at the peak of the second wave, and it was a very helpless situation. So these kind of things tend to leave a psychological scar, and I know I'm not going to get any help from the state. So what are the battle preparations should my family make in order to survive the third wave, if at all it arrives at my doorstep?
I think what your family should be thinking about is the help they can offer others, because they've been through a really bad experience, and whatever helped you cope, pay that forward. You also have to remember that if you have been infected with Delta particularly during the second wave, and you've been vaccinated, you're probably in a, most likely in a much better situation than most people who have only received vaccine. So you have a real opportunity to help other people from your experience. And in terms of your own preparedness, it's the same things that we've done before, making sure that you limit potential sources of infection. But in your case, you can afford to take a little more risk than most other people can because you've been through it. This is called hybrid immunity. It's also sometimes called super immunity because it's better than the immunity that you get from vaccination alone. So you've been through a very difficult time, but that difficult time leaves you with, both your experience, which has value to others, but also an immune response that is likely to be better positioned to protect you the next time around.
Hi, good afternoon, ma'am. So I recently read an article a couple of months ago by a chap called Nicholas Wade in the Atomic Bulletin, and he talks about the origin of the virus with regard to with regard to gain-of-function mutations.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, what is your take on it? Do you think it's an artificially engineered virus, or do you think it's just something that has happened? Because he talks about this whole concept where there is a breach in the species barrier, where the virus has crossed over from one species directly to humans. So I just want to know, what is your take on the origin of the virus? Thank you.
So coronaviruses infect a lot of species, not just SARS-CoV-2. Coronaviruses in general can infect a lot of different species. Now, what's possible and what's probable? It's possible that this is an engineered virus. It's possible that this is a virus that was being experimented. This may be a natural virus that was being experimented with in Wuhan, that they induced gain-of-function mutations, and that resulted in a virus that was more easily able to infect and therefore more easily able to spread, and there was a lab leak that let it out. It's very possible. Did it happen? And will we ever know? I think you can answer that question.
Hi, good afternoon. I was having an interesting discussion with a friend the other day regarding how Omicron took over most of the cases and became the dominant variant in South Africa when it first broke fairly quickly. And we are talking about how plausible it is that a very mild strain breaks out and becomes the dominant strain in the world, and that's actually a good thing in terms of the entire journey of the virus. How plausible is that? And also, is there any data on how coronaviruses mutate and in which direction would they go, either for this specific virus or coronaviruses in general?
So the reason people got worried about Omicron as soon as it was found was because if you look at the phylogenetic tree that shows you the relationships between all the viruses, this one is out on a very long limb by itself. How did it acquire all these mutations, right? Because usually when you have mutations, as we discussed, you require lots of cycles of replication. This mutation happens, then that mutation happens, then you add another one, then you add another one. How did you add so many and not find the branches or the viruses that were along that long branch? And the theories for that are, maybe this was a virus that evolved in Africa where there's very little detection of viruses, where there's no sequencing going on, and we only found it when it emerged into the human population in a place that had the ability to sequence. That seems a little bit unlikely, given that if it really was that, something that easily able to spread, would not have stayed in a population very long, right? So unless it was a hugely, maybe it's people who live in a desert and only once in a while come into people, something like that. But even then, all of them would have needed to get infected and sick. The second theory, of course, is that this was in immunocompromised individuals, and that is likely because we've seen this from immunocompromised individuals that they make an immune response, but it's not enough to shut down virus replication completely. So you keep acquiring mutations over time, and then the person either finally clears the virus or dies, and the latter is more likely. But before that, they pass it on to someone else, and now you have a new evolved virus that can take over the world. So that's one theory. Then there's the reverse zoonosis theory, which is that the virus went into animals, evolved in animals, and then made the jump back into humans, which again is something that could likely happen pretty much anywhere in the world. So we have three theories for how Omicron evolved. Now, is it a good thing to have a mild virus that spreads around the world? Sure, but only if it gives you broadly protective immunity against a range of both the existing viruses as well as viruses that are to come. Will that happen? We don't know yet.
Hi, good afternoon. So my question is this. When you have a virus as transmissible as COVID with a new major variant evolving every 4 to 5 months, it appears, in a world that's as well connected as it is today, is there any practical way for a country to actually not just detect but prevent new variants from getting hold within the country? Because travel bans obviously don't seem to be doing that.
So vaccinate everybody with the best available vaccines. And as yet, we don't know what the best available vaccines are. And monitor your immunocompromised individuals. Because we've seen this before. For something like polio, immunocompromised individuals will excrete the virus for years, 30 years and counting. There's a guy in the UK who has been excreting polio virus. Okay, so that can happen, and that's a source of mutations. So if you can identify all the people that are immunocompromised and continue to monitor them in case they get infected, then that's one way that you can definitely make sure that you suppress the emergence of new variants. Can you do it 100%? You can't. In some ways in India, I guess, this is an argument that has been made for polio. It sounds very cruel, but that it is at the individual level. But people with immunodeficiency in India don't survive very long. So if you have people that are excreting viruses for a while, then they're only excreting it while they're around. So.
Hi, doctor. So my question is about the implications of how we've changed our life over the last 2 years. Arguably, we are right now way more hygienic in the last 2 years than we've been maybe in the last 20. Could that have any implications going forward on, like, in thinking about blind spots, about like natural immunity for other diseases that we might turn up that might have been actually moving around and people were building up some defenses to it, but now are not?
Okay. So this is a very middle class mindset, right? So in the kind of areas that I work in, which are really what used to be slums but is improving now, there hasn't been very much change in hygiene. If you look at the masks, the same mask is being reused all the time because it's for form's sake. But even that little use of masks that has been happening around the world led to a reduction in respiratory syncytial virus. It led to a reduction in influenza circulation around the world. So certainly as long as we continue with these restrictions, all respiratory diseases will decrease. All people with asthma and other kinds of respiratory conditions will do better. Your question is a little bit different, which is more related to the hygiene hypothesis, where it's argued that a little bit of exposure to dirt is a good thing. That to see worms, to be infected in early life actually shapes your immune system. And if we become over hygienic, that might lead to more allergies and autoimmune diseases. So that is something that certainly seems to have happened in the West. But these are all ecological studies. And whenever you have a study that's based on large populations, then it becomes very difficult to conclusively prove that hypothesis.
We have time for one more question, but I'd like to just ask one. When this whole thing started 2 years ago, we first heard from England saying herd immunity is the way forward. Sweden tried it. Australia and New Zealand felt they could actually secure their borders. A president said one day miraculously it'll go away. So what's the learning at a global level that the next time around something happens, what's the best way to go around this whole thing? That's one question. The other quick question, when Omicron broke through, they said we will know in 2 to 3 weeks. Do we know from what happens in the live population, or is it simulated in the lab condition and more information is available?
Okay. So in terms of herd immunity, I think people's understanding of herd immunity was a little flawed, because herd immunity is not a switch. It's not like if I reach 70% or 90%, the disease miraculously stops or goes away. Herd immunity is a gradual building up of population exposures that decrease transmission. It works really well when you have a virus where infections can be slowed by prior immunity. And for Omicron, that doesn't seem to be happening. So that's why people say this is a nail in the coffin of herd immunity. But it doesn't mean that disease was not reduced because people have had prior infections. So distinguish between infection, which is I have a test that is positive, and people getting sick. So people getting sick, yes, you will have greater protection when you vaccinate or have prior infections. But test positivity, you may not be able to affect with herd immunity. So it's important for us to understand that. This is not miraculously going anywhere. And initially, there was a lot of focus on this COVID zero campaign. And it was done by epidemiologists, scientists, governments, etc., that unfortunately don't study the kinds of infections that I study. Because I look at it and I get scared when anybody says zero disease for a new disease, because the first 90% is easy, then the next 5% is as much effort as the first 90%, and then the closer and closer you get to 100% eradication of something, it becomes harder and harder. If there's one lesson we've learned from polio, we tried for 30 years and the story is not yet over. Let's start to say we will eradicate another disease, which is what the COVID zero campaign was really about. So that was your first part of your question, was Omicron. So the Omicron lab stuff, so there are 3 things really that we need to understand. The first one is about, are people who have been infected or vaccinated before able to neutralize this virus? It kind of gives you a signal of how well the immunity that you have in people who have been vaccinated or infected is going to work. And we have that information. We know neutralizing antibodies are 25 to 40% lower than they were for other older ancestral variants. So it's not going to go, it is going to break through immunity more than others. The second is, how severe is disease going to be when this causes infection? And that's where real world data and making sure that you have information on the spectrum of disease that you see in people, particularly the vulnerable, becomes really important. And the third thing you need to look at is what kinds of, are your interventions likely to have effect with the layering that we can put on. Remember that we now have masks, ventilation, etc., but we also have drugs. Those drugs have not been tested yet. And those drugs may work in an outpatient setting where we have not had an intervention previously. We know that the antibodies most likely are not going to work that well against Omicron, but if we can prevent severe disease with the drugs, then we might wind up being able to handle this better than we've handled previous approaches.
Doctor, I'm sorry if this has been answered before. I just came in a little late. Any visibility on the children's vaccination program in India?
Okay, that was the remaining question, and happy to take that. So, when should you vaccinate children and with what vaccine? I'm not, I spend my life thinking about children's vaccines, and with everything you have to do a risk-benefit assessment. So, what's the benefit to the individual child versus the risk to the individual child? And it differs for each vaccine. Now, we know from disease data in other parts of the world that adolescents can very rarely develop severe disease. In teenagers, it's a bit higher. In school-going children, it's less. In preschool children, it's even less. It's not zero, but the risk of severe disease is very, very, very low. In that situation, do you want to vaccinate kids as a priority? To me, I would like to vaccinate children when I know what the best vaccine for children is. And in India today, we have only 2 vaccines. One of those 2 vaccines is not being used in children anywhere in the world. Covishield is not used in children anywhere in the world, which may be the wrong thing to do because actually the risk of severe effects with Covishield is relatively small. And most of the countries that are using Covishield are using it only in older populations, so we don't even have a measure of what the risk is in younger populations. So I think it might be all right, but we do have to be aware of the side effects, how to recognize them, how to handle them. And that doesn't happen very well in India. Where Covaxin is concerned, it's an inactivated vaccine. It's an inactivated vaccine with a new adjuvant, never used in humans before. Now, I would like to see ZyCoV-D licensed for use down to 12 years, but a DNA platform. And we've never had DNA vaccines in humans before. So what would I like to see? I would like to see a really solid safety data set in millions of people that have received Covaxin, that have received ZyCoV-D, that have received Covishield, and then slowly and with monitoring come down the age spectrum. First 17-year-olds, 18, 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, come down in a stepwise fashion with monitoring. Can it be done in India? It can be done in 300 million people in India. It cannot be done in the other billion. What we've seen from safety monitoring in the 1.3 billion doses we've given out is that last month they were reporting on severe adverse events that happened in January. So, yes, we will get to children, but let's do this carefully and let's do it with the best vaccines, the safest vaccines.
Ma'am, schools have started offering both offline and online mode. There is a wave of confusion and there's lack of clarity. As a parent, what should I do?
Send your child to school. Send them with masks. Make sure that they understand that if anyone has a respiratory infection around them, they need to be careful. The activities that result in spread are talking, singing, dancing, etc. Not so much playing around, not so much sitting in class, especially when classes have fans on and windows open. But I think it's really important for children to be in school, to be interacting with their teachers, interacting with their peers. And the risks to children are very, very, very low. So, I know it makes everyone nervous, but I think we really need to understand that risks are very low for healthy children.
All right, on that note, thank you, Dr.